You can say something right now and it would inspire me to write a song or something to happen. You know, most kings just happen to be inspired by a Basquiat drawing, you know, the drawing, and he had the most young kings get their head cut off on the bottom. And I looked at that and I was like, it's powerful.
Jean-Michel Basquiat is a name that reverberates through the art world. A graffiti artist turned art sensation, Basquiat is one of the most iconic and enigmatic artists of the 20th century. His work challenged the conventional boundaries of art, and his paintings are some of the top-selling contemporary pieces being sold at auctions today. In May of 2017, his untitled painting sold for $110.5 million to Japanese billionaire Yusaku Maezawa, which at the time was the priciest work ever sold by a U.S. artist. Basquiat referenced fine artists such as Jean Dubuffet and Cy Twombly, writers like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, and musicians like David Bowie and Miles Davis. He would look at how early rappers at the time would use samples in their music, and he would do the same with his art. In the same way artists would borrow from James Brown, he'd borrow from Picasso. His reference points were many and eclectic, as he'd paint with the TV on, music blasting, and with reference books all around him.
We asked Basquiat about the words in his paintings. Where do the words come from?
Real life books, television.
Yeah, and you just skim them and start including...
No, I mean, when I'm working, I hear them, you know, and I just throw them down.
Oh, yeah? Well, I mean, things like Punic Wars. I remember that was in one of your...
Oh, that was from a guidebook on Roman history.
Using inspiration from poetry, anatomy, typography, trash TV, and so on. This allowed him to create visual collages that were incredibly unique. His work was filled with cultural references and esoteric allusions, taking on politics, pop culture, racism, and art history. He's been referenced by numerous hip-hop artists, including Kanye, Jay-Z, Nas, and J. Cole. His rise came extremely fast as he managed to squeeze a lifetime's worth of work in just 10 years' time, as he tragically passed away at just 27 years old. Basquiat's journey begins in Brooklyn, New York in 1960. Born to a Haitian father and Puerto Rican mother, he had a multicultural upbringing which heavily influenced his art. Basquiat experienced adversity very early on in life. When he was just 7 years old, he was hit by a car while playing in the street. He broke his arm and suffered several internal injuries, causing him to require a surgery to remove his spleen. While he was hospitalized, his mother bought him the book Grey's Anatomy, which would ultimately influence his art going forward.
I wanted to do some anatomy stuff.
And
then I went out and bought some books that were about anatomy.
And then you started imitating.
Well, not really imitating, because, you know, but I use them as a source material.
He mainly grew up with his father, primarily due to his mother's mental state, as she was in and out of mental hospitals for most of her adulthood. Overall, he was a gifted kid as he learned to read and write by the age of 4 and was fluent in English, Spanish, and French. The family bounced around a bit during his early years, first living in Brooklyn, then moving to Puerto Rico for 2 years before settling back in the BK, and he would attend Edward Moreau High School. During these years, he really struggled due to his mother's mental instability, and he began to rebel. He would often skip school, he ran away from home, slept on park benches in Washington Square Park, and he even got expelled for pranking his principal. He would eventually drop out altogether at 17, which caused his strict father to kick him out of the house. In 1976, Basquiat met Al Diaz at City As School High School. The two bonded over their academic problems and Puerto Rican heritage. In 1978, they began to spray paint graffiti on buildings all over Lower Manhattan, working under the pseudonym Samo. The phrase was something the two made up, short for same old shit. The tag would usually accompany the copyright symbol, along with short phrases which served as poetic and satirical advertising slogans. Same old tags were different from other tags at the time because there was always a message attached to it, a deeper form of expressionism as opposed to people just writing their names.
Me and Basquiat were in school together. I came from high school of art and design, and we met at City as a school, alternative high school where it wasn't the usual classroom format. It was you'd go out and do stuff, you know, like actually be involved in stuff. And the same old was started out as a private joke. It came from the expression same old, right? Like you hear two older black guys, you know, talking and say, hey, what's up, babe? And one guy will say, same old, you know, same old shit sort of thing. It was more about the timbre, the sound of the term. So we like played with it.
On December 11th, 1978, the Tags would get their first taste of public recognition. The Village Voice, a news and culture paper, would publish an article about the same old graffiti going around, and then an interview with both Jean and Al. After dropping out of school, Basquiat was heavily active in the Lower East Side, including the East Village, Soho, and around the School of Visual Arts. This is where he would befriend fellow artists Keith Haring and Kenny Scharf. In hindsight, this was a legendary crew, considering the notoriety and impact they collectively made in the art world. Artist Keith Haring had been following the same old graffiti and befriended Basquiat that year. Haring recalled, "I still hadn't met Jean-Michel. I had only heard about him. Well, one day a kid came up to me just as I was going into SVA, and he asked if I could walk him through past the security guard. He wanted to get inside the school. I said sure, and we walked through. I disappeared into a class. When I came out an hour later, I noticed there were all these fresh same old poems and tags in places that they hadn't been an hour ago. I put two and two together and realized that the person I had walked through was Basquiat." In 1979, 19-year-old Basquiat appeared on the show TV Party, hosted by Glenn O'Brien, and revealed himself as Samo. He and O'Brien would develop a close relationship, and he would make regular appearances on the show afterward.
Jean-Michel.
Right. So tonight after this really good meal, I want to go to the movies, right, to see Taxi Driver. And then when I got there, I put my $10 in the window. The lady disappeared for a minute and came back, gave me back my $10 and said, "No music, man, this is serious." So I was like denied entrance to a movie theater,
Why?
they said it was my appearance, that looked like a bum,
That same year, Basquiat met Michael Holman at the Canal Zone party, and together they formed the rock band Grey. They performed at various clubs around the city, including Max's Kansas City, CBGB, and the Mud Club. Around this time, Basquiat moved in with Alexis Adler, who lived in the East Village section of Lower Manhattan. Adler, who was a biology graduate at Barnard, saw firsthand his creative explorations. He couldn't afford canvases, so instead he used the floors, walls, doors, and furniture to work on. He'd also create postcards and sell them around the city for $1. While selling these postcards in Soho, he saw his idol Andy Warhol at the WPA restaurant in Manhattan's Spring Street with friend and curator Henry Geldzahler. Geldzahler dismissed young Basquiat initially, but Warhol ignored it and bought one of his postcards titled "Stupid Games, Bad Ideas." This would be their first encounter, but little did they know that this would eventually lead into a full-on professional relationship. Later that year, Basquiat began working on O'Brien's independent film Downtown 81. The feature film wouldn't actually get released until the year 2000, almost 20 years later. He was homeless at the time of the movie and slept in the production office. The film vividly depicts life in Manhattan's downtown explosive art and music scene between 1980 and 1981. Basquiat's first public exhibition was at the Times Square show in New York in June of 1980, where Jeffrey Deitch was the first to mention him in a press article titled "Report from Times Square."
A lot of people thought that Jean-Michel came from the ghetto, that he was a real tough street kid. Jean-Michel didn't come from the ghetto, but he was a real tough street kid. He left home around age 15 and basically lived on the streets of Greenwich Village. He slept in Washington Square Park. His father, in fact, told me a story about coming to find him and finding him in Washington Square Park and trying to bring him back home. Well, like a lot of artists, Jean-Michel reinvented himself. But what was extraordinary about Jean-Michel is that he didn't wait until he was 30 years old to do it. He did it when he was 15, 16, 17 years old. Jean-Michel was the type of person who would have ended up at the center no matter what. But he had that instinct. I believe I first saw his work in his apartment with Diego Cortez. Diego had met him.
In February of 1981, he participated in the New York New Wave show at New York's PS1, curated by Diego Cortez. 119 other artists were present, including Keith Haring and Andy Warhol. In 1981, he would meet art dealer Anina Nozay. Nozay took interest in his paintings early on. She owned a gallery in Soho and really wanted to represent him. With his lack of resources, she gave him cash to buy supplies and offered up the gallery's basement storeroom for him to use as his own studio. By '82, Nozay would put on his first show, which featured his canvas paintings, all of which sold out, and Basquiat became an overnight success. He'd eventually leave the Nose Gallery, and gallerist Bruno Bischofberger became his worldwide art dealer. Nose had represented Basquiat for about 4 to 5 months at this point, but the main reason for him leaving was because despite his several warnings, she sold multiple paintings of his that to him weren't finished. Bischofberger would then become his worldwide exclusive art dealer until his untimely death, and gave Basquiat his own one-man show at his gallery in Zurich. So in a very short amount of time, Basquiat went from being a homeless, relatively unknown artist to becoming an absolute superstar. That same year, in October of 1982, Bischofberger would arrange a lunch for him to meet none other than Andy Warhol at his studio turned nightclub called The Factory. The two would immediately hit it off. Warhol brought his Polaroid camera and began taking pictures of the young artist. Then they took a few together. Then out of nowhere, Basquiat decided to leave before they even finished lunch. He returned about an hour later with a fresh painting, paint still wet, of the two together, and he named it Dos Cabezas. Visitors and employees flocked around to see the painting, and it was easy to say that Warhol was impressed, saying, "I'm really jealous. He is faster than me." This would officially mark the beginning of their infamous relationship. The two began to work together frequently and created famous works such as Arm & Hammer 2 and Untitled General Electric 2. It made for a timely combination as Warhol in the early 80s was struggling to maintain relevancy. He was considered a has-been, and Basquiat was a young up-and-coming talent. Fresh eyes and a way for Warhol to stay in touch with the new generation. Unfortunately, the relationship was short-lived. It all started at the Tony Shafrazi Gallery show in 1985. The critical reaction to the show was poor, with Basquiat being referred to as Warhol's mascot. In a New York Times article after the show, it became an embarrassment for the pair to even be seen together. Basquiat took it personal as he didn't want people to look at him as just another Warhol protege. Eventually, he would slowly stop calling Warhol, and then altogether the two would stop collaborating, and the relationship never recovered from there. On February 22nd, 1987, Andy Warhol passed away. His heart stopped beating after he had been recovering from gallbladder surgery. Basquiat struggled to cope with his death. His drug use continued to worsen. In 1986, his girlfriend Jennifer Good was able to get him into a methadone program, but he quit after just 3 weeks. In the last months of his life, Basquiat became a recluse. Despite his attempts at sobriety, Basquiat passed away at his home on August 12, 1988 from a heroin overdose. He was found unresponsive in his home by his girlfriend Kelly Inman. The greatest black contemporary artist of his generation was gone too soon at the young age of 27. His funeral will be held at the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. In the obituary, Herring wrote for Vogue, he stated, "He truly created a lifetime of works in 10 years. Greedily, we wonder what else he might have created, what masterpieces we have been cheated out of by his death. But the fact is that he has created enough work to intrigue generations to come. Only now will people begin to understand the magnitude of his contribution." Basquiat left the world with over 1,000 paintings and drawings. After his death, the New York Times indicated that Basquiat was the most famous of only a small number of young black artists who have achieved national recognition. His stamp on pop culture is unparalleled. From references by musicians to his influence in fashion, Basquiat was able to leave his mark in the world, contributing the best way he knew how. From rebellious street kid to a legend in the art world. A leader in the neo-expressionism movement, Jean-Michel's work will continue to reverberate through time.